Hello and welcome to another episode of India and Global Left. If you are new to the show, please smash that subscribe button. Also consider becoming a YouTube member, a Patreon, or donate small amount given in the link in the description box. But the least you could do is to watch this show, like, share, and subscribe. Without further ado, let me welcome our guest tonight, Ben Norton. Ben is a journalist, a media analyst, political commentator, and the main person behind the very important platform Geopolitical Economy Report. Ben, welcome back to India and Global Left.
Thanks for having me. It's always a pleasure being here.
I want to get started with what's happening in Venezuela, but largely US Latin America relationship. Donald Trump has, the Wall Street Journal actually published the report that Donald Trump has told Pentagon to have an interventionist policy in Latin America in the pretext of carteling the drug mafia, as he calls it. And it includes special forces operation, precision targeting, etc. There has been enormous pressure built on in Mexico. And Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum has directly ruled out any possibility of use of US military force inside Mexican territory. And on September 2, as the world was focusing the transition from SCO into the Chinese Victory Day, the US blew up a boat in the South Caribbean, killing 11 people, allegedly related to the Venezuelan organization Tren Aragua. Earlier, we saw the U.S. use the 1798 Alien Enemy Act to deport more than 200 people to the concentration camps in El Salvador. The U.S. has also bumped up the bounty for Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro. And now they are mobilizing 4,000 troops in the coast of Venezuela. How would you describe what the Trump administration is doing to Venezuela in particular? And do you think it is something specific to Venezuela, or should it be seen in the larger context of what they are doing to Latin America?
Great question. I'll start by answering the latter part. It's part of a larger context, and this is related to the U.S. attempt to assert hegemony over the Western Hemisphere. Now, Politico, the major U.S. media outlet, published a story based on a leaked copy of the National Defense Strategy that is allegedly being considered by the Pentagon, which used to be called the Department of Defense. It now has been renamed as the War Department, which is the original name before World War II. And the War Department, allegedly in this new National Defense Strategy, says that its top priority is the Western Hemisphere, is reasserting control over the region. And really what we're seeing is this attempt to bring back the neo-colonial, the old school colonial Monroe Doctrine. This is a 200-year-old colonial doctrine from 1823, in which the U.S. government essentially said that Latin America is part of its imperial sphere of influence. You know, when people claim that Latin America is Washington's so-called backyard, this is this very colonial mentality. And we actually saw during Trump's first term that numerous top officials in the U.S. government invoked the colonial Monroe Doctrine, including Mike Pompeo, who was CIA director turned Secretary of State, and also John Bolton, who was the neoconservative war hawk who was Trump's national security advisor. And let's not forget that during Trump's first term in 2019, the U.S. launched yet another coup attempt in Venezuela, one of many which I can talk about. And in this coup attempt in 2019, the U.S. tried to impose a little-known right-wing opposition politician in Venezuela as the so-called president. His name was Juan Guaido. Now, Guaido had never participated in a presidential election, so it was completely undemocratic and absurd. And yet, the U.S. recognized him as the so-called interim president of Venezuela, and the U.S. forced many other countries, primarily in Europe, but also right-wing governments in Latin America, to also recognize Guaido as part of a concerted coup attempt. The Wall Street Journal reported at the time in 2019 that the Trump White House had planned this entire operation with right-wing multimillionaire oligarchs in Venezuela, including Leopoldo Lopez, who is a very far-right figure who is from one of the wealthiest families in Venezuela. So that coup attempt failed, obviously. Still today, Nicolas Maduro is the constitutional president. He's still in Miraflores, the presidential palace in Caracas. So that coup attempt failed. But as part of that coup attempt, Trump massively expanded the sanctions on Venezuela that had already started under Obama. And Trump expanded those sanctions into a full-on economic embargo. So, like the US blockade on Cuba, which has gone on for over 60 years in blatant contravention of international law, every year in the UN General Assembly, almost every single country on earth votes to condemn the illegal US blockade of Cuba. Even all of Europe votes against it. And the only countries that vote to support it are the US and Israel consistently for over 30 years. So similarly, the Trump administration used that same strategy of economic suffocation against Venezuela, and it massively hurt the Venezuelan economy because Venezuela has been a petrostate for 100 years, well before the revolutionary leader Hugo Chavez was even born. Venezuela has been a petrostate, and imagine what would happen in Saudi Arabia if the U.S. put a blockade in Saudi Arabia and tried to prevent it from exporting its oil. It's very likely the Saudi monarchy would collapse in a week or two. The fact that the Venezuelan government has been able to hold on is a testament to the fact that the revolutionary process started by previous President Hugo Chavez still has a lot of popular support. I'll talk about that in a few moments here, but getting back to this idea of the Monroe Doctrine. Now, the U.S. has backed many coup attempts in Venezuela going back decades. In 2002, 2014, 2017, 2019, and now they're backing yet another coup attempt. And of course, part of this, one main reason that a lot of people talk about, which is not insignificant, is the fact that Venezuela has the largest oil reserves in the world. It used to be a cash cow for major U.S. fossil fuel corporations like Exxon that were exploiting Venezuela's oil. And Hugo Chavez, the revolutionary leader, kicked out the U.S. fossil fuel companies, and he fully nationalized the oil industry in Venezuela, which was run by the state-owned company PDVSA, PDVSA. Now, I'll talk about that process and the reforms in recent years. I mean, it's kind of complex. But getting back to this idea of the Monroe Doctrine. So Venezuela has always been a thorn in the side of the U.S. empire's project to try to colonize this region and impose puppet regimes and, you know, the so-called banana republics like the U.S. had in the early 20th century, which it has desperately tried to go back to. And Venezuela has always been, in particular, well, since the revolution began under Hugo Chavez in 1999, Venezuela has always been a very progressive force in the region, pushing for Latin American regional integration against U.S. hegemony, which is very important, but also deepening South-South integration and cooperation. So Chavez recognized from when he entered office in Venezuela in 1999, he wasn't talking about socialism at that time. He was a left-wing nationalist, but he launched the Bolivarian Revolution, influenced by Simón Bolívar, who was the general who led the war against Spanish colonialism. And he freed South America from the Spanish Empire and created the modern nation states in South America, including Venezuela and Colombia and Bolivia. So Chavez was influenced by this revolutionary legacy of Bolívar. Originally, he was not talking about socialism. He was influenced by this anti-colonial legacy, and he was a left-wing nationalist. But it was through the U.S.-backed coups, especially in 2002, and the attacks on his democratically elected government that kind of radicalized him and moved him more toward the left, and he began talking about 21st century socialism was the term and such. And the point is that Chavez, even before his socialist turn, he always recognized the importance of Venezuela in building a multipolar world. In fact, in 1998, the year of the presidential election that Chavez won, he gave a famous speech in Caracas in which he talked about the importance of building a multipolar world. Now, if you listen to some people today talk about this multipolar project, they usually attribute it to China and Russia. But it's very important to emphasize that other parts of the global south, including especially left-wing forces in Latin America, have also been talking about this for decades. Chavez back in 1998, Lula da Silva in his first two terms as president of Brazil in the 2000s was also talking about the importance of multipolarity. So the Latin American left has made this a significant priority. Of course, Lula was one of the architects of BRICS in 2009, back when he was still president of Brazil. And Chavez was very much part of this movement. And in particular, Chavez, under his leadership in Venezuela from 1999 until his death in 2013, he was really the first Latin American leader who really allied closely with China. Because for the historical reasons of the Sino-Soviet split, and especially after Nixon's trip to China in 1972, let's be honest. I mean, I'm very sympathetic to China, but in the 70s, China basically allied with the US against the Soviet Union. That's essentially what it was. China would say that they had a, strategic autonomy and it wasn't a formal alliance. It wasn't a formal alliance, that's true, but it was a de facto partnership against the Soviet Union. And in much of the vast majority of the Latin American left leaned much more toward the Soviet Union, especially Cuba, although Cuba has since had very good relations with China since. But, the Latin American left, for the most part, in the so-called Sino-Soviet split, or in the Sino-Soviet split, in the so-called, anti-revisionism argument, most of the Latin American left was condemned by the Maoist forces as revisionists, in scare quotes. Obviously, I have a lot of problems with that argument. But so the reality is that most of the Latin American left did not have a very positive view of China. It was really Chavez, and then after him, Rafael Correa in Ecuador. They were the two who really began looking more toward China. There are academic studies that look at Venezuela's agreements with China, and they just explode. The number of agreements signed, the bilateral agreements signed between Venezuela and China, just explode exponentially under Chavez, and then have continued under Maduro. So Chavez played a very important part in deepening the integration of Latin America with China, and of course Russia. Now, going back to the Soviet Union, and also after the overthrow of the Soviet Union in 1991, the Russian Federation maintained very close ties with the Latin American left, and of course has remained a close partner of Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, and other countries in Latin America. So Venezuela has also been a major target of the U.S. because of those relations, and also Iran. So obviously, a lot of people, if you think about it simply ideologically, it does seem a little strange superficially if you say, well, Iran is an Islamic republic, it has a religious orientation. Socially, it's kind of conservative, although people often underestimate the progressive economic policies and the strong welfare state in Iran, and the redistributive policies, and in particular the social programs, public housing, these kinds of things, especially under Ahmadinejad in Iran, which Ahmadinejad was president of Iran when Chavez was president, and they formed a very close friendship and partnership. So superficially, people say it's kind of weird that the Islamic Republic of Iran allied so closely with the Latin American left. But then you also see, Iran's foreign policy, which is very much anti-colonial, kind of what used to be called third world nationalist, solidarity with the global South, with Latin America and Africa. So Venezuela also became very close to Iran. And the partnership with Iran was also very significant because after the U.S. imposed heavy sanctions on Venezuela, Iran provided a lot of technological assistance to help repair and modernize Venezuela's oil industry. Because, as I said, Venezuela has been a petrostate for a century, well before the revolution began under Chavez in 1999. And Venezuela's oil industry, all of the technology was from the U.S., all of it. So when the U.S. began imposing sanctions on Venezuela, starting under Obama in 2015, Obama signed an executive order in 2015 declaring Venezuela to be an extraordinary threat to U.S. national security, which is completely absurd. Obviously, people think that Venezuela is going to bomb the U.S. It's complete nonsense. But this was the justification legally needed to impose unilateral sanctions without the approval of Congress. Congress probably would have approved it anyway. But Obama started the economic war on. Well, actually, you can go back even further to the oil lockout that started after the failed US-backed coup in Venezuela in 2002, where the US was backing these forces and through NGOs and USAID and the NED backing these forces that were part of a bosses strike and an oil lockout in the company, the state-owned oil company, which at that time the Chavistas didn't really have full control over. But anyway, the economic war really accelerated under Obama in 2015, and Venezuela was no longer able to buy technology to repair and update its oil infrastructure, which really started degrading. So between the sanctions and the inability to modernize its oil infrastructure, Venezuelan oil output collapsed. And Iran actually played an important role, along with Russia and China as well, which have significant oil industries, state-owned oil industries. Those three countries, but in particular Iran, played a key role in helping to repair and update and change a lot of the actual capital investment in the fixed capital formation, fixed assets in Venezuela's oil industry. So the point is that obviously, Venezuela has this left-wing revolutionary project. They start talking about socialism and building Latin American unity and creating institutions like the Community of Latin American Caribbean States, CELAC, and including the ALBA, the Bolivarian Alliance, which was an attempt to build an economic bloc in Latin America that eschewed the US dollar. And Venezuela and Ecuador were the two biggest countries that were selling their oil in other currencies, and they even created a new Latin American currency to try to get off the dollar, which was called the sucre, named after another South American anti-colonialist who fought against the Spanish Empire. So, I mean, they were at the cutting edge of things that are now very hotly discussed issues today in the 2020s: de-dollarization, multipolarity, South-South cooperation. Chavez was trying to do this 20 years ago. He was very much ahead of his time. And for a variety of reasons, he wasn't able to accomplish a lot of this, but he was really trying to do so. So yeah, I mean, people do talk about the oil, and clearly the oil is a factor, but it's not just a factor. The reason I am providing all this context is that Venezuela is really the kind of poster child of everything the U.S. empire fears, of a revolutionary project that is not only trying to seek sovereign control over its natural resources and kick out U.S. multinational corporations. One check, something the U.S. fears. The second check, second box being checked, is that Venezuela has always been since the revolution, has been a key voice in Latin American regional integration. The third check is that Venezuela has tried to integrate Latin America with Asia and Africa as part of a larger global South-led project. The fourth check is that Venezuela in particular has very close relations with both China and Russia, and military cooperation, not just economic and political cooperation. I mean, I can go down and down the list of all the things that the U.S. fears about Venezuela. So the U.S. has been desperate to try to destabilize and overthrow the Venezuelan government for many years. This is yet another attempt. And the strategy that Trump is now using is this nonsense about drugs, which is completely absurd. Look at UN data of leading experts on the global drug trade. They say that Venezuela has negligible drug production. The biggest producer of cocaine in the world is Colombia, Venezuela's neighbor, which historically has been the closest U.S. ally in the region, which historically has been dominated by right-wing, very conservative oligarchic regimes. For the first time ever in Colombia's history right now, since 2022, they have a left-wing president. For the first time ever, there had been left-wing presidential candidates who were assassinated in Colombia's history. So Gustavo Petro, the current president, is the first ever left-wing leader, and the U.S. has also been backing coup attempts against him, especially Marco Rubio, who hates Petro and is constantly attacking him publicly. But Colombia, everyone knows, is the global epicenter of cocaine. The vast majority of cocaine production in history has come from Colombia, and then at a lower level from Peru and Bolivia. And then Ecuador plays a key role in the transportation of cocaine. And especially right now, Ecuador is governed by a U.S. citizen, Daniel Noboa, who is the son of the richest billionaire oligarch in Ecuador, a relatively poor country, but the richest billionaire. He personally owns ports, and it's very well documented in Ecuador that the Noboa Sr., the oligarch, he uses his private ports in order to export cocaine in banana crates. This is very well documented. So the U.S. is ignoring all of that because Ecuador is now closely allied with the U.S. under this U.S. puppet who's a literal U.S. citizen who was born in Florida. It's crazy that Latin American countries allow U.S. citizens to be their president. But by the way, Guatemala had a very right-wing president until recently who was an Italian citizen. I mean, this is the kind of neocolonialism we're talking about today. But in terms of Venezuela, its role in the global drug trade is totally negligible. But this goes back to Trump's first administration when he was to try to justify his coup attempt in 2019. His DOJ put a bounty on the head of Maduro, a constitutional president internationally recognized by international law sitting at the UN. The U.S. Department of Justice put a bounty on his head, and then now they've expanded that even further to $50 million, demanding the head of Maduro. And the original claim in Trump's first term was that supposedly Maduro was involved in drug trafficking. Complete nonsense. The U.S. government they fabricated this claim that Venezuela is part of the so-called Cartel de los Soles. It doesn't exist. Even Gustavo Petro, the president of Colombia, publicly has said there is no Cartel de los Soles. It does not exist. It was fabricated. The only reference ever to this organization has been by the U.S. government and its proxies in the region. It does not exist. And the U.S. invented this as part of their strategy to say that Maduro is not a legitimate president. In fact, Rubio, the warmongering U.S. Secretary of State and National Security Advisor in the U.S. government, Rubio has said that Maduro is not a president. He's a drug lord. So this is the justification they're using to massively intervene in Venezuela's internal affairs, to militarily threaten Venezuela, to threaten an invasion, to threaten airstrikes on Venezuela, and to kill 11 Venezuelans in a boat. The U.S. claimed that supposedly they were trafficking drugs. There's no evidence of that. And even if there were evidence, this is a major crime against international law because you can't just say that someone's in a drug cartel and then just kill them. That's against international law. They're not a recognized non-state armed group. I mean, even despite all the many criticisms I have of the so-called war on terror, Al-Qaeda is recognized by the UN as a terrorist group and a non-state armed group. And okay, yes, engaging in some kind of military struggle against this recognized terrorist group, there's more legal grounds for that argument, even though in many cases the U.S. was violating the sovereignty of countries where it was active, carrying out these strikes like in Syria and Iraq. But there's more of a legal argument you can make. The UN does not recognize so-called Tren de Aragua, this Venezuelan drug cartel gang. The UN and other international organizations do not recognize them as non-state armed groups and terrorist groups, unlike the U.S. government, which unilaterally declared this and is now launching military attacks on Venezuela. This is blatantly against international law. This is not even a war crime because the U.S. is not technically at war. I mean, unless the U.S. has declared war against Venezuela, then it would be a war crime. This is worse than a war crime. This is just a massacre. This is just terrorism. The U.S. is just killing Venezuelans by saying we declare them a terrorist. It's completely insane. And this is part of, a ladder of escalation. The U.S. is moving up and moving up, threatening military action. And during Trump's first term, Mark Esper, who was the Raytheon vice president, who became the Secretary of Defense, now known as the Secretary of War, he was Trump's Secretary of Defense in his first term. After he left, Mark Esper wrote a book, a memoir about his experience. And in that book, he talks about how the Trump administration in the first term was regularly discussing the possibility of airstrikes, missile strikes on Venezuela, military attacks. They were already talking about it in the first term. Now they're carrying it out in their second term. And I should point out that during Trump's first term in 2020, there was a botched invasion, a failed invasion of Venezuela, which was called Operation Gideon, that was carried out by Venezuelan and Colombian mercenaries led by two U.S. Army veterans, U.S. Special Operations Forces veterans, who were leading this invasion of Venezuela that failed because a bunch of unionized Venezuelan fishermen who were part of a union that supported the Bolivarian Revolution and supported the Venezuelan government. They saw these mercenaries trying to invade Venezuela, and they told the Venezuelan authorities, and they were caught. So this was a U.S. government-linked failed invasion. One of the people involved in this, a Colombian mercenary leader who was then imprisoned by the Colombian government, in testimony in Colombian courts, she admitted that they were in touch with the CIA and other U.S. forces involved in this operation. And the Jordan Goudreau, who was the U.S. American, U.S. military veteran, special operations forces veteran, who was also involved, even though he didn't physically do the invasion, he trained the forces in northern Colombia when they had a right-wing government at the time that supported the coup attempt against Venezuela. Jordan Goudreau was the U.S. veteran who was training these mercenaries to invade Venezuela. And then later, he sued the Trump administration in court because Trump, as always, violated his contract. I mean, he's a long history of doing this, of screwing over his contractors when he was a real estate developer in New York. Well, this mercenary sued Trump in court and said that the U.S. government supported his operation to invade Venezuela. But when it failed, it was botched, then the Trump administration washed its hands and claims that they had nothing to do with it and refused to pay these mercenaries they contracted. So, I mean, what Trump is doing is not new. He's continuing exactly what he did in his first administration, but more overtly now. And I could talk much more about this, but I have already said lots of things, and I'll let you ask whatever question you want.
Yeah, no, that's extremely helpful. I wonder, you began by talking about this long history of Monroe Doctrine of 200 years, but even if one limits oneself to 100 years, there are these different phases of U.S. intervention in Latin America. I'm thinking about the pre-1940s, where there used to be direct, overt, and blatant form of interventions. I'm thinking about Honduras, 1911, 1912, at the behest, effectively, of the United Fruit Company to protect their plantation colonies, leading to what popularizing the phrase banana republic, or invasion of Mexico in 1914, 1916, basically to protect U.S. oil interests. I'm thinking about Nicaragua's occupation, 1913 to 1933. Same time, Haiti was colonized to turn off some kind of moderate land reforms that were going on. And all that was very blatant. And after the war, things changed effectively in one way, that they tried to find an excuse, and that excuse was communism, effectively. I mean, and then they began the same thing in Guatemala, Jacobo Arbenez, going to the failed invasion of Cuba. I'm thinking about Chile, and then the long protracted struggle in the 1980s in El Salvador and Nicaragua. That's kind of the second phase. And if you like, the third phase would be beginning with Panama in 1989, where the drug trafficking thing sort of came in very directly. And that became another excuse. And we saw this throughout 2006 in Mexico, in the Colombo plan, where, how would you place what they are doing with this trope of narco trafficking and the national security threat to the United States, et cetera, et cetera? Is this some form of new accelerated phase that began in 1989, or is it something even wilder and worse than that?
Yeah, well, you raised some very important history there. I just want to briefly talk about some of this, because what's often not that well known or thought about is that the U.S. attempt to colonize, and colonize is the correct term, to colonize many parts of Latin America was part of Manifest Destiny, right? Manifest Destiny is this colonial doctrine used by the U.S. colonialists who said that God gave them the land and they were going to continue expanding westward, right? And while the US was expanding westward from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean, the two coasts we think about today as the contiguous US, the US colonialists were also expanding southward, right? So today we look at a map of the US, the contiguous US, and we think, oh, it's very logical that it goes from Atlantic to Pacific and that it goes down south to Texas. But it was not inevitable that the map looked like that. I mean, it was not inevitable that all of the West was colonized by the U.S. It was not inevitable that the south of the U.S. became part of the U.S. This was all colonized through a longer historical process. And do you know when Hawaii became a U.S. state? It was not until 1959. So, in the US, I was educated in US public schools. They teach us that the US is this very logical, contiguous country. It has 50 states. It's a neat round number. But it's kind of actually a fluke of history that it ended up being 50 states, that it ended up being Atlantic to Pacific, because the colonialists wanted to take more land. And of course, Trump now, he has pledged many times that he wants to expand the US empire. He wants to colonize Greenland. He wants to colonize Gaza on the other side of the world. He wants to colonize even potentially Mexico and Canada. He wants to colonize the Panama Canal, which was the territory, in scare quotes, the so-called sovereign territory of the U.S., recognized as part of the U.S. So, I mean, the U.S. colonial process in Latin America never really ended, but it had to take a pause after World War II because then, you had national liberation struggles, you had the UN Charter. The U.S. was trying to portray itself as a more progressive force in the world that was not a colonial empire like the European colonial empires. But really, up until World War II, the U.S. was a straight-up classical European-style colonial empire. So, for instance, in 1846, U.S. colonialists invaded Mexico, and they colonized the northern half of Mexico. So, much of the U.S. territory today, California, Arizona, Texas, even New Mexico. Why is it called New Mexico? Because it was colonized from Mexico. It was stolen from Mexico in a war of aggression started by the United States in 1846 that ended in 1848 with the military defeat of Mexico. And the U.S. empire forced Mexico to sign an unequal treaty ceding the northern half of Mexican territory, including some very oil-rich regions. So, similarly, as the U.S. was invading Mexico, it was also trying to colonize other parts of Latin America, including up throughout the 19-teens and 1920s into the 1930s. The U.S. was trying to colonize Central America. You talked about the military occupation of Honduras. Also, in 1912, the U.S. military invaded Nicaragua and occupied Nicaragua, trying to turn it into U.S. territory for 2 decades. Finally, after 21 years of U.S. military occupation, they were expelled in 1933 by a revolutionary general named Augusto Sandino. Sandino created the Army in Defense of National Liberation. It was a coalition of many revolutionaries across Latin America, including Faramundo Martí, who was the leader of the Communist Party of El Salvador. So then later, in the 1970s, during the national liberation struggles against U.S. imperialism, you had national liberation struggles in Africa and in Asia. Well, Latin America also had national liberation struggles. This is why in Nicaragua, they created the Sandinista National Liberation Front. That's what FSLN stands for, which is the ruling party today of Nicaragua. They were a national liberation front like the National Liberation Front of Algeria, like the National Liberation Front of Vietnam, fighting against French colonialism in both of those countries. The Sandinista National Liberation Front of Nicaragua was fighting against U.S. neocolonialism, and they were called Sandinista because they were inspired by the legacy of Augusto Sandino, the revolutionary general who fought against the U.S. colonial military occupation in the 1920s and 30s and succeeded in expelling the U.S. empire in 1933. Similarly, in El Salvador, you had the FMLN, which was the Faramundo Martí National Liberation Front, named after the former leader of the Communist Party of El Salvador, who also fought with Sandino against the U.S. military occupiers. So, I mean, you mentioned the case of Haiti. I mean, the U.S. military has invaded Haiti many times, including within our lifetimes, including in the 1990s and then again in the 2000s. The U.S. backed 2 military coups against the left-wing democratically elected president, Jean-Bertrand Aristide, who was a revolutionary liberation theology priest who became a president. And he's the only person I can think of in history who was a victim of two US-backed coups separately in two different presidential terms. And in the case of Haiti, I mean, it's some of the most blatant colonialism because the French Empire colonized Haiti. They had a glorious revolution. They expelled the French. And then the US Empire replaced the French Empire. This is why it was famously Simon Bolivar, the leader who fought against the Spanish Empire in the 19th century. He famously wrote a letter in which he said that the United States seems destined by providence to replace the Spanish Empire. He said, the quote is, the United States seems destined by providence to enslave us in the name of liberty. That's what Bolivar said of the U.S. So they could see as early as the mid-19th century that the U.S. empire was replacing the Spanish Empire. And that's exactly what happened. The Monroe Doctrine in 1823 was, as always, the U.S. empire has always had, and even European empires, you know, they had this whole idea of the white man's burden. They were bringing civilization in scare quotes, right? The U.S. empire had the same rhetoric, but the U.S. was bringing progress and modernity to Latin America. And if you read the Monroe Doctrine, it was portrayed as a progressive doctrine. It was portrayed as an anti-colonial doctrine. This is how, you know, what we would call Orwellian today. James Monroe was saying, well, actually, we are helping Latin America fight against the European colonialists. The U.S. was saying the European colonialists will not be tolerated in the southern hemisphere, the southern part of the Western hemisphere. That the U.S. will prevent the European colonialists from interfering, which was their way of saying, no, this is our imperial sphere of influence. We don't want the Spanish and the French and the Portuguese here. It belongs to us. And if you listen to the way that the Monroe Doctrine is now invoked today in the 21st century, it's in the same context. Every time U.S. politicians invoke the Monroe Doctrine, they're saying that China and Russia cannot have consensual bilateral relations with countries in Latin America. And they claim that China and Russia are supposedly the new colonial powers, in scare quotes, which is just laughable. Tell that to anyone in Latin America, even right-wingers, and they'll laugh at you. It's completely absurd. Because even the right-wingers who are all, you know, comprador sellouts, who are all invested in the U.S., they have dual passports, even they want to trade with China. Like, even the billionaire right-wing president of Chile wanted to trade with China. Even the horrible right-wing leader of Argentina right now, Javier Milei, he wants to trade with China. I mean, it's completely laughable. They all know that the U.S. is, even though many of them are pro-U.S., I mean, anyway, it's completely absurd. So, by the way, on the note of Haiti, before I go back to more modern day, on the note of Haiti, it's not that well known, but when the U.S. Marines invaded Haiti, they went to the central bank of Haiti, and they literally took the gold out of the central bank. I mean, this is just straight up colonial pillage. Like, this is exactly what the Europeans did in Asia and Africa. So this is what the U.S. has done in Latin America, and it never ended. The difference is that because of after World War II, because of the UN Charter and the anti-colonial struggles and national liberation, the U.S. couldn't do it as explicitly as it had done before. So you have what Nkrumah in Ghana referred to as neocolonialism. So the U.S. uses puppets and dictators to rule on its behalf. And then you get famously to 1954, a year after the first CIA coup, which was in Iran against Mossadegh in 1953. A year later, in 1954, the CIA backed a coup against the democratically elected left-wing leader of Guatemala, Jacobo Arbenz, who was not a communist. He was a progressive left-wing nationalist who wanted land reform. You mentioned the United Fruit Company, now called Chiquita. They rebranded. The United Fruit Company refused to allow the elected president of Guatemala to implement land reform. The CIA backed a coup against him on behalf of the United Fruit Company. And then you can go down the list of the dozens of coups that the U.S. has backed in the region since then. But I should point out that the U.S. has continued militarily intervening in Latin America, even though there were many more military interventions, especially in the 19-teens and the 20s up into the 1930s. There were dozens of U.S. military interventions. They didn't completely end. So, for instance, in the 1980s, the U.S. invaded both Grenada and Panama, tiny little countries. I mean, one of the most powerful global superpower invades these tiny countries to overthrow their independent leaders. In the case of Grenada, it was to overthrow a revolutionary leader that had been allied with Cuba. And then in the case of Panama, it was to overthrow, I wouldn't call him a revolutionary, that's giving him too much credit, but an independent, very strange leader, but an independent leader who ironically had been allied with the CIA and had been a notorious drug dealer, Noriega. Now, Noriega was a drug dealer, that's true, but for most of his history as a drug dealer, he was working with the CIA and Pablo Neruda. And then he became more of an independent nationalist leader who wanted to assert national control over the Panama Canal because the colonial unequal treaty that the U.S. imposed on Panama after the U.S. helped to create Panama by breaking it off from Colombia, the unequal treaty was going to expire, and Noriega wanted to nationalize the Panama Canal. And the U.S. refused to allow that to happen. The U.S. invaded. Well, actually, I should go back. So actually, I take that back. The U.S. Jimmy Carter did allow Panama to finally take control over the canal, but Noriega wanted to do that much earlier. But anyway, the point is that Noriega, I confused the chronology there, but the point is that Noriega, even though he had been a long time U.S. backed drug dealer and CIA asset, he was too independent for the U.S. and he was overthrown. Like Saddam Hussein, by the way. Saddam Hussein was also a longtime CIA asset. He was originally, when there was a Ba'ath coup in Iraq, he was the CIA's man against a more left-wing leader in Iraq. And the U.S. ironically supported the Iraqi Ba'athist Party because they saw it as a counterbalance to the more revolutionary forces that were governing Iraq that were allied with the Soviet Union. So, I mean, there's a long history of the U.S. doing this kind of thing. But anyway, the point I'm getting at is that the U.S. never stopped these military interventions in Latin America. It invaded Grenada, it invaded Panama, and in the 1980s, the U.S. was very militarily active in Central America, in Nicaragua, El Salvador, and Guatemala. So in Guatemala, there was a genocide carried out by the Guatemalan military, carried out by Efraín Ríos Montt, who was a U.S.-backed military dictator and also an evangelical fundamentalist extremist who was closely allied with the Reagan administration, who said that God told him he had to exterminate the indigenous Maya population because they were godless, according to him, godless polytheists. So the U.S. military was deeply involved in backing that genocide in Guatemala because the forces there was a revolutionary guerrilla force that was Marxist that was active in the indigenous areas. And then the UN had a Truth and Reconciliation Committee, and they found that the US-backed military regime carried out almost 100% of the civilian casualties in the so-called Guatemalan Civil War. It was not a Guatemalan Civil War. It was an extermination campaign to crush the Guatemalan indigenous communities and left-wing guerrillas, which had support among the majority indigenous community. In El Salvador, there was a very similar process in which the U.S. backed the brutal military junta against the revolutionary guerrilla forces led by the FMLN. Massive death and massacres, including the infamous El Mozote massacre, where U.S.-backed forces massacred hundreds of civilians, and including the CIA-backed death squads who assassinated Oscar Romero, who has now been canonized as a saint by the Catholic Church, who was he was not involved in armed struggle. He was a left-wing priest who preached liberation theology in poor areas, so the CIA had him exterminated by these U.S. proxies. And then in the famous Contras, which, by the way, you know what Contra means in Spanish? It stands for Contrarrevolucionario, which means counter-revolutionary. That was the literal name of them. The proud counter-revolutionaries who were created by the CIA. Former leaders of the Contras admitted in the New York Times that they were CIA puppets. One of the leaders literally said he resigned because he didn't want to be a CIA puppet. And he also admitted in the New York Times that the Contras burnt down schools and hospitals faster than the Sandinistas could build them. That's a quote from a former Contra leader. This was the CIA puppet army that terrorized the people of Nicaragua, that killed tens of thousands of civilians. I mean, the U.S. has never left this region alone. I mean, it has used indirect forces, but literally millions of people in the 20th century were killed by the U.S. or indirectly by the U.S. through its puppet regimes in the region. And today, what's happening essentially is that, so, I mean, again, obviously I'm passionate about this. I could talk about many different things, but I'll conclude with this thought and then you can ask another question. But essentially, I think about U.S. imperialism in Latin America in a series of phases. So you have the anti-colonial struggles against the Spanish Empire, in which, for cynical reasons, the U.S. portrayed itself as an ally of the anti-Spanish forces because the U.S. wanted to replace the Spanish Empire, and it did. So you have that first phase, which is in the early and mid 19th century. And then in the late 19th century into the early 20th century, you have the era of U.S. colonialism, not neocolonialism, straight up old school style U.S. colonialism, where you had U.S. colonization of the northern part of Mexico, of Puerto Rico. So in 1898, you have the so-called Spanish-American War, where the U.S. supports nationalist forces in Cuba and Puerto Rico and the Philippines to fight against the Spanish Empire. And then after the Spanish is defeated, the U.S. literally colonizes Puerto Rico. It remains a U.S. colony to today. And the U.S. colonizes the Philippines, which remained a U.S. de facto U.S. colony or protectorate until the 1950s. And then Cuba, which remained a de facto U.S. colony or protectorate until the revolution in 1959. And if it were not for the Cuban Revolution, Cuba would probably be a de facto U.S. colony today. So the U.S. literally took over the Spanish colonies. So this is the era of U.S. colonialism from the mid to late 19th century until the early 20th century. And then after World War II, you have in the 30s, you have the good neighbor policy, which is very cynical, but, Roosevelt tries to improve relations with Latin America because they're more focused on preparing for World War II and war with Japan. So then from the late 30s until roughly the 80s, you have an era in which the era of U.S. neocolonialism, where the U.S. is not as directly involved, but it is definitely in backing many coups, supporting military dictatorships in basically every country in the region. So that's the era of U.S. neocolonialism, the first phase of it. And then after the overthrow of the Soviet Union in the 1990s, the U.S. it's a little less explicit. I would still consider this an era of neocolonialism, but it's not as explicit in the Cold War, right? Because in the Cold War, because of the so-called threat of the Soviet Union and the justification, the U.S. was very explicitly backing military dictatorships, military interventions, the Contras. It was all well known. By the 1990s, this is the unipolar era. The U.S. is no longer afraid of revolutionary movements in Latin America, so it can, allow these neoliberal governments in the region to have a little more room to breathe. And the U.S. It's no longer seen as as appetizing, as appropriate to openly support military dictatorships. So in the 80s, the U.S. allows bourgeois liberal democracy in Chile and Argentina. It allows the military dictatorships to be ousted because previously it had given them all this military aid and support to massacre protesters to keep them in power. By the 80s, it's clear that the Soviet Union is declining. You have perestroika and all of this. So the U.S. no longer needs the blunt fist of military dictatorships to keep control over the region. It can now do it indirectly through neoliberal regimes. So, you had the Brazilian military dictatorship, which actually compared to the other military dictatorships, especially in Chile and Uruguay and Paraguay and in Argentina and Brazil and not Brazil and Bolivia, these were explicitly neoliberal military dictatorships. Whereas the Brazilian military dictatorship was actually, interestingly, a developmentalist military dictatorship that was very invested in industrial policy and turning Brazil into an industrial powerhouse. So, ironically, after the U.S. had supported the Brazilian military dictatorship from the very beginning, from a CIA-backed coup, in the 80s, they allowed the return to bourgeois liberal democracy, and then they privatized all the state-owned enterprises. They implemented financial liberalization of the financial sector, financialization of the economy. So ironically, it was actually the Brazilian bourgeois liberal democracy that oversaw the deindustrialization of Brazil's economy. So, but the point is that in some ways, some of at least in the case of Brazil, the the bourgeois liberal democracy was even served U.S. capitalist interests even better than the old school Brazilian junta. That's a long history. But unlike Chile, Pinochet was the classic neoliberal, and Argentina under Videla was also a classic neoliberal. So anyway, in the 80s and 90s, you have the liberalization, and the U.S. no longer needs the blunt fist of the military dictatorships. And then what I think is I think we're entering a new era now, where the U.S. empire is clearly in decline. You have the new Cold War, the fear of Chinese and Russian influence in the region, and the U.S. is now returning to its old school Cold War style policy of more explicit neocolonialism compared to the kind of neoliberal era where the hard fist of the U.S. empire was much softer, and it allowed these, neoliberal regimes to govern, especially because you have the rise of Chinese and Russian influence, and because you had a series of left-wing governments in the region, the so-called pink tide in the 2000s and 2010s. In the 2010s, the vast majority of governments in Latin America were left-wing. So the U.S. needed to return to more explicit interventionist policies of backing military coups and dictatorships. And I expect in the decades to come, it's going to be much more explicit U.S. intervention like we saw in the earlier era of U.S. imperialism, simply because, this is also, when you're listening to this, you're probably thinking this is the exact same policy in Asia, right? So, for instance, the U.S. throughout the first Cold War backed military dictatorships in South Korea, in Taiwan province, in southern Vietnam. They were all military dictatorships. There was no bourgeois liberal democracy. It wasn't until the 80s that South Korea finally they liberalized politically and economically, by the way. And South Korea's massive industrialization and so-called economic miracle was under Park Chung-hee in the 60s and 70s, under a developmentalist military dictatorship. And then you had liberalization politically and economically. Japan had liberalization. Japan has been a one-party state with a few exceptions, but almost without exception since 1955. Taiwan province was a dictatorship until the 1980s. Singapore has never really been a liberal democracy. So in the Cold War era, the U.S. had to have these military dictatorships in order to maintain control over these regions in Asia, in Africa, and Latin America. And now what we're seeing is that the U.S. empire's control over these regions is weakening. So unlike in the 90s, where it could just rule indirectly through the comprador bourgeoisie in these ostensibly liberal democracies, they were basically liberal democracies in Latin America and much of Africa and much of Asia. The U.S. no longer wants that. It wants to go back to the old school style, straight up military dictatorships or illiberal democracies they have the illusion of being democracies, but they're just authoritarian regimes. And I think what we saw in South Korea with the failed coup attempt, there are reports that Yoon Suk-yeol, this very right-wing Trumpist figure who did a failed coup attempt and tried to assassinate the current leader, Lee, there were reports that the U.S. government was involved in that. And obviously it failed, but I would not be surprised at all if we see more and more military coups. And we saw in Bolivia in 2019, a very explicit violent coup. I think we're going to see much more of that in the years to come in the new Cold War.
One of my colleagues, Daniel Ferreira, he looks at the difference between the nature of military dictatorship in Brazil and Chile. And he makes the same point that in Brazil, the military dictatorship was very different in nature. The labor movement was very strong inside that alliance. Not all sections of the labor movement, but large segments of the labor movement, particularly in the urban. I also want.
I'm
Yes.
sorry. I swear I won't bloviate. I know I have a tendency to rant, but just a quick note on this. It's very fascinating, and this history is not very well known. I'm glad you made that point. So, in Latin American history, we tend to associate, and in global history, people on the left tend to associate military regimes with the right and the far right. And obviously, I'm not a defender of military regimes, but we also need to understand history objectively. And not every military regime in the 20th century was right-wing. Well, it depends how you define right-wing, but economically
or
right-wing.
even today, we are seeing in Sahel.
Yeah, exactly. And this is why when we saw these military forces in the Sahel, in Burkina Faso and Niger and Mali, some people were confused, but actually, if you go, I mean, I mentioned Park Chung-hee in South Korea, who's a very complicated figure, but in his youth, he was a member of the Korean Workers' Party and was actually seen by the CIA. They were afraid when he launched his coup originally in South Korea. The CIA was afraid that he would be too friendly to the DPRK, to North Korea. And at first, he actually tried to improve relations with the DPRK, but there was so much pressure by the U.S. that he ended up aborting that attempt. But Park Chung-hee was a straight up, I mean, he would be called a socialist if he were in power today. He nationalized all the banks. He implemented very strict industrial policy that included state-owned enterprises, that included massive state-led industrialization campaigns through state-owned metalworking and state-owned even some state-owned basic industry, like heavy industry and basic light industry. So, but in the case of, and also the same thing was true for Taiwan, by the
And
way.
strict
Like,
planning, strict
yeah,
centralized planning.
the Guomindang was. I mean, I'm not a big fan of the Guomindang either. But to be objective historically, the Guomindang was not neoliberal at
They
all.
did they
They were
did land
very state-led.
reforms. They did land
Yeah,
reforms in the 50s and the 60s, which
yeah.
was enormously important for the next phase of tech growth and modernization in Taiwan in the that
And
came in
this
the
is where
same
the,
year.
the exactly. And this is where the geopolitics of it comes in. Because if those kinds of forces were not allied with the US, they would be demonized as socialists and communists and they would be overthrown, right? The reason that Taiwan and South Korea and even Japan were allowed to implement these state-led industrialization campaigns is precisely because they were Cold War
China,
allies of the
there was
US.
there was China, so they
Yeah,
need
of course. So similarly, Brazil is the same story. So Brazil's military regime was very developmentalist, state-led, and in fact, when Deng Xiaoping initiated the reform and opening up, this is in Isabella Weber's book, very important book, How China Escaped Shock Therapy. She talks about how the Chinese economic planners start after 1978 in the 80s. They sent teams around the world to study different industrialization processes. They were sent to Japan and South Korea. They were also sent to Brazil to study what Brazil did because Brazil in the 80s was a major industrial power. Well, that was the peak. It started declining from then on. But anyway, the point I'm getting at is that it's not that well known, but there were a few, not a lot, but there were a few left-wing military governments in Latin America. The majority of them were right-wing and pro-US. But for instance, Peru under Velázquez had a left-wing military government that launched a very radical revolutionary process that also included not only nationalization of the commanding heights of the economy, but importantly, it included a pro-indigenous campaign to recognize the sovereignty of indigenous communities and their languages in Peru, which has always been a major problem in Peru, like we see now, where anytime you have a government that is sympathetic to the indigenous peoples, there's a coup against them. This is what happened to Pedro Castillo, the left-wing leader who was imprisoned and overthrown in a coup backed by the U.S. And so Velázquez, this military leader, he was himself, of European descent. Like basically every leader in Peru's history, except for Pedro Castillo, they're all European. I mean, they had a leader named Kaczynski, obviously of Polish descent, and then they had Fujimori, who is of Japanese descent. They had no indigenous representation in their leadership in Peru, and they had this left-wing military leader, Velázquez, there was a coup against him, well, an internal coup, and then there was another coup, but the U.S. was destabilizing him. He was actually allied with the Soviet Union. So Latin American history is a little more complicated, but it is fair to say that the vast majority of the military regimes in Latin American history were pro-U.S., and especially throughout the first Cold War. And the point I was going to get at is that I wouldn't be surprised if we see a return to that in the new Cold War.
I want to plug two of our interviews that has links to some of the things you said. One was a full show on Haiti we did with Professor Jemima Pierre. We covered a lot of grounds, including how the progressive Franklin D. Roosevelt took charge of overturning reforms and revolutions in Haiti. But we also covered what happened with Aristide and later on in Haiti in the 90s and 2000s. The second one I want to plug in is one show we did with um, excuse me, I'm blanking on his name. who wrote the Counter Revolution of 1776, Gerald Horne, Professor Gerald
Jared Horn,
Horne,
brilliant
where
historian.
yes, where we this thing came up about the rivalry between the Spanish Empire and the 13 colonies in the coast at that time. It was not the United States as such. And he made the point that the Spanish Empire, even though, and the Portuguese Empire, the basically the Catholic empires, including the French in Quebec, for instance, they were colonialists, but they were relatively more progressive insofar as allowing former slaves to participate in military, to participate in other forms of government officials, and etc., which the North American Protestant colonies vehemently denounced. And the second point was also on the importance of how different groups came to the North American colonies had to be reunited through the trope of race, because the Irish Catholics, German or Italian Catholics were always seen as people with treason by the Protestants, and ultimately, when they had to be united against the black, this whole trope of whiteness had to be reinvented or invented in many ways for the first time as a unifying force. Ben, you mentioned West Asia in the passing, and one of the things I've been seeing is a huge amount of solidarity among Latin Americans with the Palestinian cause. Of course, very concrete steps taken by Gustavo Petro of Colombia, but also solidarity by Brazil, etc., and large sections of people across Latin America. And something that struck me as you were answering the second question in particular is how much of the playbook in US colonization of West Asia or imperialism in West Asia and Latin America has been borrowed from each other. As we speak, this assassination campaigns in Lebanon, in Gaza, in Iran, in Yemen, which has been done by Israel, but we know they have been basically done by American support. I mean, Palantir and all these tech groups are basically American companies who are giving them all the intelligence. And that is very similar to blowing up of the boats. Or one can think about death squads in Latin America and how things were run in Afghanistan or parts of Iraq at that point in time. Or sometimes there were direct links of people in the name of war on terror being sent directly to Guantanamo Bay, which is a Cuban territory, basically. And now we are seeing the Trump administration designating randomly groups as foreign terrorists. I mean, groups in Ecuador, in Mexico, in, of course, in Venezuela, which is very similar to what they have done with West Asia, Houthis, Hezbollah's, Iranian Revolutionary Guard, Hamas. I mean, you just randomly designate people as terrorists, and there is this link between classic Latin American style colonialism and the war on terror. And terrorism has been now invoked in Latin America very directly under the Trump administration. And to make one more point was that the CIA borrowed the playbook used in 1953 in Iran to topple Jacobo Arbenez's government in Guatemala next year. So I think it's very important for people like us to build this solidarity across West Asia and Latin America, because they are sometimes they feel very divided. They speak very different languages. They are territorially separated. So if you could tell us a little bit about the similarities that Washington uses in imperializing in its imperial project in West Asia and Latin America, maybe that would help people to connect the lived experience of colonialism. Yep.
Yeah. So you made a really interesting point that is not that well known, and it's really important to emphasize this. Many of the same tactics of insurgency or counterinsurgency that the U.S. used in Iraq and Afghanistan were first used in Latin America and by some of the same people. So the most well-known is Oliver North. I don't know if you've heard of him. He was a big name in the 1980s because of the Iran-Contra scandal. And he was involved in helping to train the Contras in Nicaragua that were using these extreme terror tactics and also, by the way, trafficking drugs. And then those drugs ended up being dumped in poor black communities, primarily in the US, especially in California and LA, which led to the explosion of crack cocaine, this horrible epidemic in the US. And that was exposed by a journalist, Gary Webb, whose career was destroyed after he exposed that. But Oliver North was also involved, of course, in the Iran-Contra scandal, but he was active in many of these circles in West Asia, in the so-called Middle East. And then John Negroponte, another name that's not as well known. He used to be talked more about in the Bush era, the Bush Jr. era. Negroponte was the U.S. ambassador to Iraq, a key figure in the U.S. invasion of Iraq and occupation of Iraq. Negroponte, also like Oliver North, was involved in working with the Contras in Nicaragua. So not only the tactics, but literally some of the same people who were involved in training the Contras in torture. There was a famous torture manual, also known as the murder manual. That was the de facto nickname given by the CIA, was the murder manual or torture manual. That was the manual they gave to the Contras in Nicaragua and to the brutal military regimes in Guatemala and El Salvador. And famously, there was a horrible war criminal in El Salvador, Obison, a French last name, but he was El Salvadorian torture leader, and he was known as Blowtorch Bob. That was his nickname that the U.S. gave him because his favorite tactic was using blowtorches to torture people, torture left-wing revolutionaries in El Salvador on behalf of the far-right Arena party in the military regime. So John Negroponte and these other war criminals, Oliver North in the U.S., who were involved in training these criminals and murderers and torturers, they were literally the same people involved in the counterinsurgency operations. So in the case of Latin America, they were doing both counterinsurgency and insurgency. Insurgency against the Nicaraguan government, counterinsurgency against the revolutionary forces in El Salvador and Guatemala, and Honduras. I should mention Honduras. Honduras also had a brutal military regime. And then in the case of Iraq and Afghanistan, it was counterinsurgency. The same people, same tactics. So it's very important to bring those two together. And I'm sorry because I was so fixated on that point, I forgot what your main question was that you asked after that.
Yeah, no, my main point was basically linking West Asia and Latin America through this lived experience under colonialism, given we have already seen so much solidarity from Latin America for Palestinian resistance.
Yeah, I have some important thoughts about this that are not that well known for people who haven't spent a lot of time in Latin America. And for context, I should mention that, I mean, I was born and raised in the U.S., but I haven't lived in the U.S. full time for like seven or 8 years now. And I am a naturalized dual citizen of Nicaragua as well. And I've been to almost every country in Latin America, but I'm still a foreigner technically to the region. But just to explain some context that people often don't know from people who have not spent a lot of time in Latin America. The solidarity with Palestine is not new, but it's increased a lot in recent years. Of course, throughout the history of the Latin American left and the anti-colonial movement, there was always solidarity with the Palestinians as a fellow national liberation struggle. So for instance, the Sandinistas in Nicaragua had a very close relationship with the Palestinians, especially with the PFLP, but with the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, which is a Marxist-Leninist group, but also in general with the PLO, including Fatah, which is the kind of mainstream nationalist, not Marxist, but nationalist, historically left-wing nationalist, not so left-wing anymore. But and in fact, during the armed struggle in Nicaragua in the 1970s, there were some Nicaraguans from the Sandinista front who went to Palestine to train with the Palestinians and to support the Palestinians, including in some armed operations. So Lele Khaled, the famous Palestinian revolutionary leader from the PFLP, an icon of the national liberation struggle, she, in her memoir, she talks about her experience of doing operations with Nicaraguans. So there was always that solidarity among the revolutionary forces in Latin America. Of course, Cuba always being the at the vanguard. Cuba, after its revolution in 1959, Cuba was always in solidarity with the Palestinians, up till today, always being a firm symbol of that solidarity. Now, most countries in Latin America during the first Cold War, because they had pro-U.S. regimes, most of them did not support Palestine, but there were some exceptions. And then, of course, after the fall of many of these regimes, and then you have in the 90s, you have these, liberal democracies, mostly neoliberal, but some of them not as neoliberal. Like in Chile, for instance, you have the Socialist Party, which, despite its name, was not really socialist, at best social democratic, redistributive, but they were pretty pro-Palestine. And then in the 2000s, with the mid to late 2000s and into the early 2010s, you have the peak of what's called the pink tide. Now, that term is not used in Latin America. It's used outside of Latin America, but refers to in every single major country you had a left-wing leader. So you had Lula da Silva and the Workers' Party in Brazil. You had Nestor Kirchner and Cristina Fernández de Kirchner in Argentina. You had Rafael Correa in Ecuador. You had Daniel Ortega and the Sandinista Front in Nicaragua. You had in Honduras, you had Manuel Zelaya from the Libre Party. I can go on and on. People know the idea. You get the idea. In Chile, you had, again, the Socialist Party, not very left-wing, but, you had these left-wing leaders. That was under Michelle Bachelet in Chile. In Bolivia, you had Evo Morales. Peru was the only country that didn't really have a very left-wing leader until Pedro Castillo, who was imprisoned. And now what we're seeing is, in the past few years, a major backlash. The right-wing forces, most of the right-wing forces took power undemocratically. So in the case of, I mentioned Peru, in the case of Brazil, the only reason that the far right under Bolsonaro was able to come to power was because there was a soft coup, a legal coup against, like a judicial coup against Dilma Rousseff in 2016. And then you had the imprisonment of Lula on bogus charges in 2018. Those charges were later completely expunged, and his record was, the Supreme Court of Brazil cleared his record. And then, you had a coup in 2009 backed by the U.S. in Honduras. And then you had a coup a soft coup. That was a straight up old school style military coup in Honduras that was backed by the Obama administration. And then in 2012, you had a soft coup in Paraguay. And then you had the many coup attempts in Venezuela in 2014, in 2017, in 2019. And then you had a very violent coup attempt in Nicaragua in 2018. And then you had the successful coup in Bolivia in 2019 against Evo Morales. So, this has continued. But anyway, the point I'm getting at is that you have these left-wing governments that come to power, and they're all uniformly pro-Palestine. Now, the reason that this is important to talk about briefly is that this is actually an even more impressive symbol of solidarity when you realize the domestic pressure on these countries, not only from the U.S., which is obvious, but also from evangelical Christians. Because one significant change, a social change we've seen across Latin America in the past 40 years, is that historically Latin America was almost entirely Catholic, excluding indigenous communities. Now, for people who might be confused, because the majority of people majority of people of Latin America have some indigenous descent, but they would not be considered indigenous. The indigenous communities tend to be, unfortunately, in many parts of Latin America, they tend to live separately, and they don't speak Spanish. They speak their own indigenous languages. There are exceptions, but there are a few countries where the indigenous communities are the majority, like in Bolivia. And Peru has a very large indigenous community, and Guatemala and southern Mexico. But there is this kind of internal racism, and there are people who are they may be very dark-skinned, but they're not considered indigenous. They're Christian and speak Spanish. So there's this kind of complex racial and cultural politics. So, for instance, Evo Morales was the first ever indigenous president of Bolivia, which is an indigenous majority country. And you've had dark-skinned presidents of Bolivia. You've also had a lot of light-skinned European descent leaders. But they were not considered indigenous because, for instance, the current president, Luis Arce, is relatively darker skinned, but he's raised Christian and speaks Spanish as his native language, right? So what happened is that because of the Spanish legacy of Spanish colonialism, the vast majority of people became Catholic. And Latin America was a bastion. It was one of the most Catholic regions of the world until really the last 40 years. And ironically, part of this is because of U.S. counterinsurgency, because obviously Catholicism has gone through waves. And right now we're seeing in the past two popes have been much more left wing. Whereas when I was a kid, I was raised Catholic. I'm an atheist, but I was raised Catholic, but I'm not like a new atheist. I'm not like one of these crazy, like, all those horrible, neocons like Christopher Hitchens anyway, like I think religion can play a progressive role as well. I understand that, it's complicated. It's part of a larger social fabric, but I was raised Catholic and I always associated Catholicism with the right and especially with the Pope John Paul II. And John Paul II, he went to Nicaragua during the Contra War and he refused to recognize the Sandinista government, which, by the way, there were two Catholic priests who were in the cabinet of the Sandinista government. The Sandinistas were basically the first ever liberation theology led movement that took state power. And most of them they were almost all Catholics, including priests who were excommunicated by the Catholic Church. At that time, the CIA was working very closely with the Catholic Church to destroy liberation theology, which was growing in influence in Latin America because obviously you have so many poor people and they're Catholic and they're tired of being preached to by rich people. And you have these priests that go to rural areas and they preach that Jesus was a revolutionary, which he objectively speaking was, by the way. And they preach that, that Christianity is a religion of the poor and that rich people are disobeying Jesus. And so you have these revolutionary movements that were religious.
The first 4 centuries of Christianity, effectively.
Yeah. Yeah, before the Roman Empire co-opted Christianity as a tool of empire, right? When it was objectively an anti-imperialist religion. I mean, and also Islam, you look at like Shia Islam, there are a lot of Islamic national liberation movements. So there are a lot of similarities. This is why I understand that there are progressive and reactionary forms of religion. So what happened is that the U.S. began to encourage a lot of evangelical and right-wing Protestant priests. And so this is one reason why the U.S. government, especially in the Ronald Reagan administration, which had some evangelicals join the new coalition of the Republican Party, they encouraged sending a lot of missionaries to Latin America. And I mentioned earlier Rios Montt, who was the military dictator of Guatemala, who carried out a genocide against the Maya indigenous community. He was also an evangelical. So the Reagan administration really turbocharged this, and the CIA was working a lot with missionaries. In fact, if you go to Central America, especially in Nicaragua, I've talked to some older Sandinistas who remember the 1980s and the fight against the Contras. They would joke that all the missionaries were CIA. That was the joke, and obviously not, still today there are a lot of missionaries, and I'm not saying that they're all CIA, but there is definitely a long history of the CIA sending these missionaries who would use religion as a platform to spread very right-wing, reactionary political ideology, not only against, LGBT people and indigenous people, but also economically, preaching, this Calvinist doctrine of if you're poor, like you have to pull yourself up by your bootstraps and the government shouldn't do anything for you. God wants you to be your own entrepreneur, all this stuff. So what has happened, not only because of that, but also it's kind of complicated because in some countries, the Catholic Church was also very corrupt and right-wing and engaged in abuse and all this stuff. So for a variety of different reasons, partially because of the U.S. and missionaries, but also because of domestic factors, the region has become more and more Protestant and more evangelical in recent decades. And many of those evangelicals are right-wing, but there actually are left-wing evangelicals. So, for instance, when Andrés Manuel López Obrador, the left-wing president of Mexico, when he won and became president in 2018 in Mexico, there was actually an evangelical political party that was part of his coalition, along with the Socialist Party, which is called the Workers' Party, and the Green Party. So Latin American politics is complicated. In Venezuela, there is an evangelical party that supports the Bolivarian Revolution and Maduro. And in Brazil, there were some evangelicals who supported Lula and the Workers' Party, but the majority of the evangelicals supported Bolsonaro. And the big, massive mega churches, which is something, a monstrosity exported from the US. These are like malls that call themselves churches that are backed by millionaires and billionaires. And many of their pastors are millionaires, and some of them own like private planes and stuff. And in Brazil, they had this has really caught on. It came from the US, and these big evangelical mega churches endorsed Bolsonaro. So the reason I mention all of that, it might seem as it's like it's totally irrelevant, but Christian Zionism really became huge in Latin America in the past 20 years or so. And this is why people are confused. If you travel to Latin America, especially Central America, you'll just randomly see Israeli flags. Like the first time I ever went to Central America, to Nicaragua, Honduras, El Salvador, you'll just see taxi drivers with Israeli flags. And it's like, wow, what is that? It's not about Israel as the country. It's a symbol of evangelical Christianity. That means that they're an evangelical. They wave the Israeli flag as a symbol of their evangelical Christianity. So what's even more confusing is not anymore, but 10 years ago, you used to see Sandinistas who would wave the Sandinista flag and the Israeli flag, which is crazy because the Sandinistas have always been extremely pro-Palestine. They broke off diplomatic relations with Israel. They do not have formal relations, but they had supporters who were evangelicals who would wave the Israeli flag. So this might all seem like a kind of weird thing, but the reason I mention all of this is that there's a lot of pressure on leaders, including left-wing leaders in Latin America, to support Israel, not because people in the region support what Israel does politically. It's entirely religious. It's because they're evangelical or some kind of Protestant, and they see like the land of Israel as part of like this biblical prophecy, right? But there's been a massive shift, especially since 2023, but in general in the past 10 years, as Israel has become more explicitly fascist, as every few years it carries out another massacre of Palestinians, and as Israel kills Palestinian Christians. So more and more religious Christians in Latin America are supporting Palestine. So even as recently as like 5 years ago, I would see a lot of Israeli flags for religious reasons, and they've basically all disappeared. And now what you see is a lot of Palestinian flags. So what's interesting is that there's a lot of pressure on these leaders in the region, and despite that, they are very principled, and the vast majority of left-wing leaders in Latin America have come out fully in support of Palestine and have even broken relations with Israel. And the reason I mention that is they're not getting anything from this. This is entirely out of principle, out of ideology, out of solidarity and support for the global South and for the people of Palestine. Because you look at Gustavo Petro in Palestine, and Gustavo Petro in Colombia, there's so much pressure on him from the Colombian right to support Israel. He has been one of the most pro-Palestine leaders on earth. He has cut relations with Israel. He recently put an energy boycott on Israel because Colombia exports a lot of oil and coal. And he said, we have an embargo on Israel. Similarly, we saw that Honduras and Nicaragua cut ties with Israel. Even Lula has been very pro-Palestine, and there's a lot of pressure on Lula because he doesn't want to lose the support of the evangelicals. So there's no excuse. The reason I mention all that is there's absolutely zero excuse for all of these countries in West Asia who are complete cowards and have done nothing to support Palestine. Because in Latin America, of all the regions of the world, the most governments that have supported Palestine are in Latin America. Mexico, Nicaragua, Colombia, Honduras, Bolivia, Venezuela, Cuba. All the left-wing leaders have supported Palestine, including most of them have joined the International Court of Justice lawsuit against Israel that was started by South Africa. Meanwhile, you look at West Asia, none of the governments have done anything to support Palestine, despite the fact that all of their people, 99% of their population supports Palestine. So this is something that I'm actually very proud of in terms of Latin America. Like, they are really at the vanguard of this, and they are extremely principled.
This is just a side follow-up question, and probably we can end our segment on this. I'm just curious about the link between neoliberal ideology and evangelical ideology in Latin America. And I'm thinking about this contrast between Brazil and Argentina. My own reading is, and correct me if you're wrong, Argentina is culturally more liberal, so to speak, compared to Brazil, which where the evangelical presence seems to be much more stronger. On the other hand, in terms of the class forces, Argentina seems to be much weaker. I'm talking about class forces from below, while in Brazil, the left is relatively stronger. I'm curious, what do you think is the interplay or connection between market-based liberal or neoliberal ideology and um, an evangelical or conservative Christian movement? Is there any link, relationship, one-on-one map, or even some opposition?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and there's a lot of good research on this. So, in general, it is definitely fair to say that many of the evangelical churches are not only conservative culturally and socially, but also economically pretty neoliberal, preaching individual responsibility, opposing state redistributive policies, opposing taxes on the rich, and but it's also complicated because you have to differentiate between the big churches and the small community churches, right? So Brazil is the kind of is at the forefront of this attempt to export this U.S. model of mega churches. Whereas in a lot of parts of Latin America, you still have small community churches. So what's interesting is in a lot of the small evangelical churches in Central America, which is probably the most evangelical region of Latin America, South America is still very strongly Catholic, although as you mentioned, Brazil is really catching on. But basically, the closer you are to the U.S., the more likely you are to have this influence of these U.S. missionaries. And if you go to a Central American country, you will see on the plane, it'll be if you're like from the U.S., if you're like I'm a white person, if I look on the plane, 80% will be darker skinned Latinos, and then you'll have a few European tourists, maybe like one or two young US tourists, and then missionaries. There are always white American or Canadian missionaries, including like people who are very, very extreme in their religious views, like people who what is the term for people who don't even use electricity? I forgot the term, but like these very extreme religious communities who like they use like 19th century clothes and don't use modern technologies. And they're like missionaries who go to Latin America. And I've heard these crazy stories. They go to the poorest parts of Latin America. I find this very exploitative. Like which is like countries like Honduras in Central America. Central America is the poorest region of Latin America. And then they will try to as missionaries, they will try to bring people into their community by giving them food and other forms of aid. But then, like, I heard stories of friends in Honduras where like, someone's grandma, she joined this, like, extreme religious community where she was gifted a TV by her son, and they expelled her from her religious community because she had a TV. So it's very strange. Like we're talking about very extreme forms of this is not the majority. But but the point I'm getting at is that there is a very strong missionary presence that is pushing these kinds of Christianity. And in small communities, if you go to like a rural town where people are extremely poor, they have a church, and the church is often run by a foreigner. And not just the Protestant churches, but also the Catholic Church. So, as an example, the current Pope, Pope Leo, he's a U.S. American from Chicago, and he spent decades working in a poor community in Peru. And I actually think, I mean, I'm not criticizing him. He's actually a very progressive pope compared to like John Paul II. And he follows in the footsteps of Pope Francis, who is also I wouldn't just say progressive. Pope Francis, in the context of the Catholic Church, was a radical pope, very left wing, anti capitalist. So the point I'm getting at is that one of the things that it can be positive, but it can be exploitative, is that these foreign churches, they fund a lot of these churches in poor communities which can be very exploitative. I think this is, I don't think it's inaccurate when people compare missionaries to the old school colonialists. I mean, it's not a coincidence that the Spanish colonialists and the Portuguese colonialists also used missionaries as part of their colonization project. And we still kind of see that today. It's a very complex, contradictory phenomenon. So in terms of the ideology they preach, it's mixed, but a lot of it is very right wing, including the Catholic Church, by the way. This is changing, but in Nicaragua, one of the reasons that when the Sandinista revolution happened in 1979, it was 98% Catholic. There were polls done, 98% Catholic. Today, it's slightly under 50% Catholic. And there are a lot of Sandinistas who are not Catholic, who are some kind of Protestant, including evangelical. And they're from small community churches. They don't have the big mega churches. And they're a big base of support for the Sandinista front. And a big reason for that is I know a lot of Sandinistas who left the Catholic Church because the Catholic Church was very right wing, not only culturally, but also economically. They had a very right wing bishop, Silvio Baez, who was, during the coup attempt in 2018, was working with the U.S. Embassy, directly with the U.S. Embassy. And in fact, Pope Francis, when he came in, he actually was very angry and he actually withdrew the bishop from Nicaragua because this bishop was participating in political protests and marches against the Sandinista government, which is insane. I mean, that's like a direct example of the church meddling in Nicaragua's internal affairs. And, you know, in the Catholic Church, there's this internal fight going on between the very right-wing forces, most symbolically represented by Opus Dei, and the more left-leaning forces, which were led by Pope Francis and some of the, you know, there were different like factions of the Catholic Church. So even within there's so many different fights going on. And there's actually, I'm very fascinated by the internal politics inside the Catholic Church because in Latin America, the Catholic Church has played an extremely reactionary role for decades, along with many of the evangelicals. Until, I would say, the last decade with Pope Francis, there is a move back toward a more progressive form of Catholicism. And Pope Leo now, I think one of the good things about him is he's very much following in those footsteps because he's also a naturalized citizen of Peru. I mean, he is a U.S. citizen and a Peruvian citizen, and he spent 30 years in Peru working in rural areas, and he's very sympathetic to kind of liberation theology. So, you know, these things evolve in different directions. Like we saw in Islam, we saw during the 70s, 80s, 90s, and early 2000s, a massive rise of Wahhabism and Salafi jihadism. And I actually think in the past decade, I'm very hypercritical of Mohammed bin Salman, he's completely betrayed the Palestinians, 100%. There's no excuse for what he's done and tried to normalize with Israel. But again, to understand these political forces objectively, we can understand how problematic these people are, but also understand what's happening. Saudi Arabia has been under a lot of pressure to crack down on the Wahhabi extremism, and there's now less Wahhabi influence today than there was 20 years ago in some of these, especially like countries like Indonesia, where there were tons of mosques in poor areas that were funded by the UAE, funded by Saudi Arabia. They were preaching this extreme form of Sunni Islam, of Wahhabism. It's the same thing with the Catholic Church and the Protestant churches in Latin America. These things kind of go in waves. So it's very interesting to study the impact of that on politics. Obviously, in the case of Islam, Wahhabism has had a very reactionary influence on many Muslim majority countries that has led to the rise of more right-wing political forces. Whereas in Iran, of course, and in Lebanon and Yemen, you have the opposite. You have a kind of revolutionary liberation theology-oriented Shia Islam that has led to these revolutionary movements. And I'm not trying to be sectarian here because there are also revolutionary Sunni movements. But I mean, we should point out that there are many Shia movements. You look at Hezbollah in Lebanon, Ansar Allah, also known as the Houthis in Yemen. You look at in Iraq has the Islamic Resistance Forces of Iraq, which are largely, they have Iraqi Hezbollah, which is very revolutionary and anti-imperialist. And then, of course, you have Iran. So, it's interesting to see how this complex kind of dialectical relationship between religion and politics in these different regions. And there are a lot of parallels you can make between Latin America and West Asia.
Absolutely. Ben, we'll leave it there. I had on my agenda to discuss more areas, but I actually don't want to bloat this important segment. We haven't done a dedicated show on Latin America for a while, so I want to keep it dedicated to Latin America. So we'll leave it there, and all our my rest of the plan to discuss Asia and the US will have another show in a couple more weeks. Thank you so much for your time.
Well, thanks for having me. I mean, I always have the problem where I bloviate. Sometimes you can just interrupt me in the future if you want. But I'm very glad that you gave me the time to talk in detail about Latin America because, unfortunately, I think it's a region that's not well enough understood. And, I am, as someone who focuses on Latin America, I feel like I don't do enough reporting on Latin America. And we talk a lot about, multipolarity and the growth of a more multipolar world. But it's not just, China, India, Russia, BRICS. I mean, the B in BRICS is Brazil, but Latin America plays a key role in this as well, and it's going to be very important as the U.S. empire kind of changes its strategy, withdraws from Europe, and
Absolutely.
focuses really on trying to reassert this neo-colonial so-called Monroe Doctrine. I'm very concerned about U.S. policy in the region in the decades that come.
Absolutely. My own sense is we have to keep a sharp focus on Latin America, particularly for two reasons. One is the class battles have been very seesaw in Latin America for very many decades. I mean, sometimes we thought that they went in on one side, but it never happened. The other side came back, and so these class struggles are fought very strongly. They are going on, so that's very important for us. But the other thing is what you said: as the U.S. empire descends on its decline, it would become more and more desperate. And the Trump administration, in particular, who was, let's give credit where it's due, they were the ones who, for the first time openly, dared saying that the U.S. system is not working. I mean, this kind of what explains Trump's populism in one way, that he caricatured himself as this anti-establishment figure, but he has been completely failing in all economic front. I mean, we didn't get a chance to discuss in great detail, but for all practical purpose, the U.S. is facing recession. I mean, of course, the Bureau of Economic, the BES, defines recession in a different way, or even the classical way of defining recession is this contraction or negative growth for 2 quarters. That didn't happen because this quarter we get positive growth. But if you look at the real indicators, it's worse than a recession. I mean, the farm sector is in enormous recession now. There are multiple papers, including the USDA's own data and papers coming out from that. There is bumper harvest on one hand on corn, but the market is just disrupted. The soy is suffering from Chinese retaliation, where it has turned to Brazil and other Latin American countries. The job numbers are just it's contracted in June for the first time since the pandemic year, so it's led to the firing of the BLS labor statistician. But that has been corroborated by all kinds of private observers, the ISM data, the consumer sentiment, for instance. The University of Michigan, who is a close observer of consumer sentiment, has found that it has been declining since the last 6 months. Or even the stock market, now 90%, Bank of America's own survey says that 90% of investors feel that overvalued.
Yeah.
And with the dollar, what we have seen is, for the first time, I think a lot of people are not observing this, is that in the all previous phase of economic crisis, starting with the global financial crisis, then the Eurobond crisis in 2012, the 2014 blowing up of the Eurobond crisis, but also the commodity crisis, the fall of the oil prices, then the COVID pandemic, the dollar will immediately shoot up because of the uncertainty. So dollar used to be unquestioned safe haven. And it's only after that, in the recovery phase, or sometimes the Fed would give stimulus, so-called, or balance sheet operations and so on, it would stabilize. They would allow it to stabilize. During the COVID, the Fed allowed the other central banks to buy dollars so that the dollar remains. But effectively, the Fed could control dollar, and this is the first time you saw an economic crisis where the dollar has been in decline for straight, I don't know, 6 months, I guess. So the US economy is in doldrums, and given there is no adequate tax policies, no labor policies, I don't think there is any rejuvenation of the US economy. It has been mostly been driven. I mean, even the 1.7% growth we are seeing, or it would be definitely below 2%, but that is being driven basically by the AI generated stock market, which is, by the way, driving up electricity prices for household,
Yep.
which is major contributor of consumer inflation. Then regionally speaking, 3 or 4 important states, California, Texas, New York, I mean, they are driving much of the growth. And the healthcare sector, I mean, the job data would have been so much more worse if not for the healthcare sector, which sometimes even reflects sickness rather than healthiness, and the AI generated allied sectors. The reality of the United States economy, as an observer who takes close look at that, I would argue that it's worse than a recession, even that they're technically not defining it as a recession. And my argument is that because of that, you would see more and more distraction, which would come in the foreign policy, and this kind of, tomahawk firing in Venezuela, maybe another adventure in Iran, something or another with Russia, or keep boiling the Taiwanese Strait. I think we're going to see more and more of this.
I agree. I mean, there's so much we could talk about. Maybe we should do it in another episode. But I'll just add a few other quick points before we conclude here, because you raised so many. If you look at the sectors of the economy where where there is job growth, it's healthcare. Whereas jobs are falling, the number of jobs is falling in all other sectors. And in healthcare, it's because, one, of the extremely bloated, ineffective, privatized U.S. healthcare system, which is a nightmare, and because of aging, because there are more people who need nurses and support. In every other sector, it's obvious that there is a recession in the real economy, and it's being held afloat by this massive AI bubble. Even Sam Altman, the CEO of OpenAI, said that it's a bubble. And he said that, and no one cared. They just kept inflating the bubble. That's how you know we're in a bubble. When one of the most powerful CEOs says it's a bubble, and they just keep buying the Magnificent Seven, right? It's really now the Magnificent Six, because Tesla is not. I mean, Tesla is very strange, but anyway, now they're paying Elon Musk more than they've ever made in profit in their entire history to try to keep Elon Musk at the company for 2 years. Crazy. But the other point is that you mentioned so many good points, but one other data point is that the U.S., the real economy has obviously been in a recession for a while now. The reason that you don't see it in the GDP figures is because the U.S. government is running massive deficits of 6% of GDP. And that was last year's. This year will probably be higher, despite all the Doge distraction nonsense. It's very difficult for your economy to, according to the way that the U.S. actually officially says it's something is a recession, because, as you said, it has to be 2 quarters of negative growth. It's very difficult to have that negative growth when you're running hugely stimulative deficits of 6% of GDP. Normally, if a country were in a recession, they would run deficits of 6% of GDP to get out of the recession, the old, classical Keynesian style. But imagine what if the U.S. actually does officially enter recession according to the way it's calculated, negative GDP growth for 2 quarters, and it's already running 7%. I mean, is it going to go 10, 12% deficits of GDP? So, because then you have all of these mandatory spending aspects that kick in, unemployment benefits. Even the unemployment figures in the U.S. are grossly underestimated, because the U.S. unemployment statistics are only for people who actively apply for unemployment with the government. A lot of unemployment in the past decade, it's like Uber unemployment. So you lose your job, so instead you drive Uber or Lyft or whatever. So those people 10 years ago would have been factored into the unemployment statistics, but they no longer are. So it's clear that the U.S. real economy has been in recession for a while. But because the financial economy is gangbusters, the stock market is breaking new records every few weeks. It's at all-time highs because largely because it's driven by the Magnificent Seven, by a small handful of corporations concentrated in big tech and AI. It's the most concentrated that the S&P 500 has ever been in history, and it's at all-time highs. It's obvious this
45
is a huge bubble. And that's
45% of the
what's making the economy look like it's not in recession, but the real economy is in recession.
45% of the crowded money is going into the Magnificent Seven. I mean, that's a
Yeah.
mind-boggling number. You also made this very important point about the fiscal stimulus that the U.S. government is doing, which is, by the way, increasing because of the tax cut through the big,
Yeah.
beautiful bill. And that's all the firing of the U.S. government to fish. I mean, one of the reasons of poor. I mean, the labor market is so bad because of a couple of reasons. The trade disruptions on one hand. I mean, I'm talking about short-term factors. The other is this enormous fall in the federal government employees. It's just massive. But despite all those quote-unquote savings, everything has increased. The trade deficit has increased. The fiscal deficit has increased. I just wanted to plug in here that one of the I've always thought about this. I mean, my research doesn't include Europe, so I'm not really an expert on that. But I've always thought about the financial system as a transatlantic system rather than something concentrated in the Wall Street in New York. So much as if one is to think about the empire of Apple, you have to think about the research and design that goes on in Silicon, or the sales that goes all across the world, to the the chip making, the TSMC's participation, to the heartland of mainland China, where Apple, or even India, where labor is mobilized from countryside, or in the case of China, even from the urban sector. So it's really a global empire. But that's easy to visualize. I think the financial empire is generally not seen as a transatlantic empire, but if you think about the euro bond market, if you think about the European banks' connection with the dollar system through London, it's very clear that it's a transatlantic system. And that's one of the reasons why, after the global financial crisis, the European economy just went into doldrums. But the other point, which is important, is why the US could at least have 2.5% growth, while Europe is the standstill. I mean, part of that is, of course, the oil, the energy sector, which Europe doesn't have it and needs to buy it. And with the kind of suicide they are doing with Russia, it has gone up. It's now buying oil from the United States as a way to sort of appease its masters. But the other point is that it doesn't have the dollar and the Magnificent Seven. So that kind of the fiscal stimulus that the dollar allows the US to have, because the borrowing cost is limited, and the concentration in this tech bubble. That's effectively the difference between a 0.5% or 0.3% growth in Germany and 2.5% in the United States. Otherwise, it's the same system. The factors of production are at the same stage of historical development. The financial banking system is the same transatlantic system. The only difference is coming out of this privilege of dollar and the privilege of Magnificent Seven and US corporation. Ben, thank you so much for your time. This was a lovely conversation.
Thanks for having me and keep up the great work.
Have a wonderful rest of the day ahead. Bye.
Hi, my name is Ayushman. I, along with Jyotisman, have started this platform. In the last 2 years, we have tried to build content for the left and progressive forces. We have interviewed economists, historians, political commentators, and activists so far. If you have liked our content so far and want us to build an archive for the left, I have two requests for you. Please do consider donating for the cause. Link is in the description below. Also, if you are not able to do so, don't feel sad. You can always like our videos and share our videos to your comrades. Finally, don't forget to hit the subscribe button.